The sterile scent of ozone and stale paper clung to the air. A familiar perfume in the quiet, hushed chambers where fortunes were made and unmade. I ran a gloved thumb over the glossy surface of a printed financial statement, the numbers blurring into an unreadable script. My mind, however, was miles away, still dissecting the images from the Elias Thorne file. Elias Thorne. The name resonated with the kind of digital empire building that shaped the modern world. His death, ruled a suicide, had been a 3-day news cycle sensation before fading into the vast archives of forgotten tragedies. Now, 6 months later, it had landed on my desk, a cold case with a thin, almost apologetic cover letter from a senior investigator. Routine reevaluation, it had read, a phrase that always tasted like a polite lie. There was nothing routine about Thorne. I was currently seated in a cramped, windowless room within an offshore law office with shred bins and locked safes, a place designed for opacity and discretion. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the only light emanating from a single anemic fluorescent fixture humming overhead. A heavy, industrial-grade shred bin stood sentinel in one corner, its hungry maw a silent testament to secrets devoured. Behind a locked, reinforced door, I knew, lay the main archive, a veritable fortress of paper and digital records, each file a potential key to a kingdom or a tomb. My presence here was ostensibly to review Thorne's estate documents, a formality, but I saw it as an extension of the primary examination, another layer to peel back. The first autopsy report, a document I had meticulously gone over just hours before, painted a clear picture. A single gunshot wound to the temple. A .38 caliber revolver found clutched in his hand. A note left on his nightstand. Textbook. Open and shut. Yet something in the crime scene photos had snagged in my mind. A tiny burr under the saddle of certainty. The angle of the arm, the way the fingers curled around the grip. It felt off. A subtle, almost imperceptible tension in the musculature that didn't quite align with the sudden collapse of a self-inflicted wound. I remembered the photograph of Thorne's hand, the lividity already setting in, the skin a pale, waxy yellow. His index finger, according to the report, was still inside the trigger guard. But in the high-resolution image, I'd noticed a faint, almost invisible abrasion on the outside of that same finger near the knuckle. A superficial scrape, easily missed, probably dismissed as incidental. My gaze drifted from the financial statement to the heavy steel door of a safe built into the wall opposite me. It was one of several such impregnable barriers in this office, each one secured with a complex dial and a digital keypad. The air here was thick with the scent of old money and newer secrets, a place where legal maneuvers were as intricate as a spider's web. I could feel the weight of countless unseen documents, each holding a fragment of truth or a carefully constructed deception. A soft knock interrupted my reverie. The office manager, a thin, impeccably dressed woman with a severe bun, entered, carrying a small, leather-bound ledger. Her face was neutral, practiced. "Mr. Kaplan, these are the subsidiary account ledgers you requested. They were in one of the off-site locked safes, just retrieved." She placed the book on the table with a soft thud, her movements precise, economical. "Thank you," I said, my voice low. I didn't look up immediately, instead focusing on the faint indentations her fingers had left on the ledger's smooth cover. She stood for a moment, waiting, before turning to leave. I felt her scrutiny, a silent question in her posture. This office, I realized, was a fortress, and I was an unwelcome surveyor. The ledger was old, its pages brittle, filled with handwritten entries in a spidery script. My eyes scanned the dates, the amounts, searching for any pattern, any inconsistency that might echo the physical anomaly I'd seen earlier. The abrasion on Thorne's finger, the strange tension in his hand. They were physical manifestations of force. What kind of force? And what kind of financial maneuvering might accompany such an act? I turned a page. A transfer. A large sum, dated 2 days before Thorne's death, moved from a holding company to an untraceable offshore trust. It wasn't illegal in itself, not here, but the timing felt like a tremor preceding an earthquake. This wasn't just a reevaluation, it was an excavation, and I was digging into something far deeper than a simple case of despair. My mind, however, was miles away, grappling with the sheer audacity of the staging. This wasn't where I usually conducted my work, but the initial investigation had been tightly controlled, its records sequestered here, far from prying eyes. My gaze drifted to the row of locked safes lining one wall, their steel doors gleaming faintly under the recessed lighting. Further down, the low hum of industrial shred bins provided a constant, almost hypnotic backdrop. A reminder of the ephemeral nature of information in this precise environment. It was a place designed for discretion, for the systematic disappearance of inconvenient truths. I pulled another file from the stack, this one thinner, marked simply, Thorne J. Toxicology. The cover sheet was crisp, official, bearing the seal of the original investigating body. I'd reviewed this report countless times in digital format, but there was a tactile difference, a weight to the paper that anchored the data in reality. I smoothed the first page, the standard disclaimers and methodologies laid out in dense paragraphs. Then came the results. A litany of compounds, their concentrations meticulously listed, the initial finding of a massive sedative overdose, consistent with the suicide narrative. My finger traced the column of numbers, a familiar dance. Barbiturates, benzodiazepines, a cocktail designed to ensure a swift, irreversible end. The lead toxicologist, a reputable figure from a firm often contracted for high-profile cases, had signed off with confidence. It was all there, clear as day, supporting the official story. Too clear, perhaps. I paused at a specific entry, halfway down the page. Compound X. Trace detected, 0.01 mg/ml. Compound X. A common over-the-counter antihistamine, often used as a sleep aid. Its presence wasn't unusual, especially if Thorne had been struggling with insomnia, a plausible scenario given the pressures of his position. The concentration was negligible, far below any therapeutic or toxic level. The original report had dismissed it as incidental, a background noise in the symphony of lethal drugs. But something about it snagged, like a single off-key note in an otherwise perfect performance. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the laminated surface slightly. Trace detected. Less than 0.01 micrograms per milliliter. It was a measurement so minute, so close to the detection limit, that most would simply ignore it. And indeed, the original report had. I flipped to the full spectral analysis, a dense printout of peaks and valleys, a molecular fingerprint. Locating Compound X's signature, I compared it against the expected profile. The peak was there, faint but undeniable. My mind began to churn, not just with the data, but with the context. Thorne was a man of meticulous habits, known for his rigorous health regimen. He rarely took even minor medications without consulting his personal physician, a detail I'd gleaned from a passing comment in a transcribed interview with his estate manager. If he were taking an antihistamine, even for sleep, it would likely be a prescribed one, or at least a specific brand he trusted. And typically, such a low dose wouldn't even register as a trace unless it had been administered very recently, or his metabolism was unusually slow. The more I stared, the more the tiny detail began to swell in significance. It wasn't the compound itself, but its insignificance that bothered me. Why was it there? Why such a minuscule amount when everything else was present in lethal quantities? A stray hair caught in freshly applied varnish. My internal monologue shifted from analysis to hypothesis. What if Compound X wasn't ingested orally? What if it was introduced differently? The thought sent a chill down my spine. The original report hadn't bothered with deeper investigation because the primary cause of death was so overwhelmingly obvious. But if the sedative overdose was staged, then everything became suspect. Even the smallest, most innocuous detail. I picked up my secure comms device, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. My fingers hovered over the contact for the head of the forensic department, a gruff but brilliant man named Alistair. This wasn't a request I made lightly. Re-examining evidence, especially in a case deemed closed and sensitive, was an act of professional defiance. It implied a failure on the part of the original investigators, and I knew it would not be welcomed. Alistair, I stated into the secure line when he answered, my voice steady, betraying none of the tension coiling in my gut. I need a full re-examination of the Thorne toxicology samples. Every single one. And I want a comprehensive reanalysis of the original tissue samples for any and all trace compounds, regardless of initial detection thresholds. A pause stretched, thick with unspoken questions. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the mental calculation of resources, political fallout. Seth, you know this case is sealed tighter than a vault at Fort Knox. The initial findings were unequivocal. They were, I conceded, my gaze fixed on the minuscule Compound X entry. But I've found something. Something subtle, easily overlooked. And if I'm right, it means the entire narrative needs to be rewritten. This wasn't a suicide, Alistair. I think it was murder. The line went silent again, this time with a different quality. The hum of the shred bin seemed to grow louder, or perhaps it was just the sudden rush of blood in my ears. I knew what I was asking. I also knew that once I pulled this thread, there would be no going back. The silence on the line had been a challenge, a gauntlet thrown. I'd picked it up. Now, the weight of that decision settled over me as I hunched over the light table, the harsh glare illuminating the blown-up crime scene photos. My workspace was a precise chaos of binders, magnifying lenses, and digital readouts. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of the filtration system, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my mind. I started with the initial autopsy report, a document so clean, so definitive, it almost felt sterile. Suicide by gunshot, simple, untroubled. I knew better. I always did. The mogul's opulent study, the antique desk, the precisely placed firearm, every detail was captured with clinical detachment. Then I saw it. A minute disruption in the dust on the floorboards, barely visible against the dark wood grain, just beside where the victim's left foot would have been. The initial investigators had likely dismissed it as an accidental mark, or perhaps not seen it at all. My gaze flickered to the full body shot. The mogul lay sprawled, one arm extended, the other bent sharply. His posture was too theatrical. A natural fall from a sudden gunshot wound rarely resulted in such a composed tableau. I zoomed in on the mogul's hands. The report mentioned no defensive wounds, no struggle. Yet, under my powerful magnification, the skin on the back of his right hand showed a series of almost invisible parallel striations, faint as spider silk. They weren't abrasions from impact, but rather the kind of marks left by a tight grip, a desperate struggle against a binding, or perhaps the forceful removal of something held. A tiny dried fleck of what looked like paint, no larger than a pinhead, clung stubbornly to a cuticle. It was a shade of deep emerald, a color not present anywhere in the study, nor on the firearm. The blood spatter patterns were next. The report detailed a clear, conical spray consistent with a close-range gunshot. But I noticed a subtle inconsistency in the satellite spatter near the wall behind the body. A few drops, too small, too perfectly round, were out of sync with the primary trajectory. They suggested a slight movement, a shift in position after the initial impact, or perhaps a second distinct event. The initial forensic team had attributed everything to a single static event. They hadn't looked hard enough. They hadn't felt the scene. My internal clock was ticking. These weren't anomalies. They were declarations. The mogul hadn't simply taken his own life. There had been a struggle, a brief, violent interaction. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase the evidence, to sculpt the scene into a picture of despair rather than murder. The concealment was expert, meticulous, designed to pass muster under a cursory glance. But not under my glance. My phone vibrated, startling me from my focused trance. It was a familiar number, the voice on the other end belonging to a senior investigator who had been unusually quiet since I'd started digging. "Kaplan," the investigator began, his tone clipped. "We've got a situation. The family's legal team is clearing out some of the mogul's personal effects. Apparently, they found some sensitive documents. They're requesting someone with your expertise to oversee the final disposition. A formality, they say. Just sign off on the destruction of personal papers." A formality. My gut tightened. Why would they need me for a formality involving paper? This wasn't a formality. It was an opportunity, or a trap. I knew the kind of information that might reside in such a place, the kind of leverage that could make a powerful man choose suicide over exposure. Polished marble gleamed under recessed lighting, reflecting the stern faces of the security personnel. The name itself was a statement of intent, a monument to discretion and the art of vanishing evidence. A junior counsel, a woman with a perfectly coiffed bob and a perpetual air of harried efficiency, met me at the elevator. "Mr. Kaplan, thank you for coming on such short notice. We're just finalizing the estate's affairs. Sensitive financial documents, you understand. We need your signature to confirm the destruction process adheres to all ethical guidelines." She gestured towards a long corridor lined with heavy, steel-reinforced doors. We walked past several offices, each with a small, discreet plaque. The air grew cooler, sterile, smelling faintly of ozone and toner. We stopped at a large room, sparsely furnished with a single sturdy table and a row of industrial-grade shred bins, their gaping mouths ready to devour secrets. Several locked safes, heavy and imposing, lined one wall. The shred bins hummed with a low, expectant thrum. "These are the last of the mogul's personal records," the junior counsel explained, her hand sweeping towards a stack of file boxes on the table. Mostly old correspondence, some financial statements from shell corporations. Nothing relevant to the unfortunate incident. My eyes, however, weren't on the boxes. They were on the shred bins, specifically the one closest to me. Its lid was ajar, and inside, amidst the ribbons of paper, I saw something that made my breath catch. A smear. Green. The exact shade of emerald I'd seen on the mogul's cuticle. I moved closer, feigning interest in the operation of the machine. The junior counsel continued her practiced spiel about data security and confidentiality. I ignored her, my focus solely on that tiny, telltale smudge. I reached out, my finger tracing the edge. It was paint. Not just any paint, but the same distinctive emerald. It wasn't on the shredded paper. It was on the bin itself. My mind raced. Someone had handled something painted emerald here. Something that had also been in contact with the mogul's hand. And then it had been put into a shredder. Unless it wasn't just paper that had gone into that shredder. Unless something else, something solid, something that could have been clutched in a desperate hand, had been destroyed here. Something that bore the marks of a struggle and the telltale emerald paint. The formality was anything but. This was where the evidence had truly vanished. A smear. Green. My breath, already held, caught tighter in my chest. It wasn't just a smudge. It had a distinct, almost metallic sheen to it, unlike any ink I'd ever encountered in office settings. My mind immediately raced through possibilities. Paint? A specialized lubricant? Something far more specific, far more deliberate. I pulled a small, sterile evidence swab from my kit, my movements precise, economical. I carefully scraped at the edge, collecting the microscopic flecks onto the swab, then sealed it in a sterile vial. This wasn't just a random smudge. Its placement, right at the opening of a bin meant for destroying sensitive documents, felt too deliberate to ignore. My gut twisted with a familiar, unsettling certainty. This wasn't suicide. This was a cover-up, and this tiny green trace might be the first thread I'd truly pulled. Back in my own controlled environment, hours later, under the focused beam of the microscope, the green residue revealed itself. It wasn't ink. It wasn't paint. It was a synthetic polymer, infused with microscopic metallic particles. A specific compound used in advanced circuit boards, particularly those found in high-end, custom-built servers. Thorne's domain. My findings were concrete, undeniable. The material was not common, certainly not something one would typically find smeared on a shred bin in a law office, unless it was directly related to the destruction of high-tech components or documents detailing their specifications. I arranged my evidence: high-resolution photographs of the smear, the microscopic analysis, the chemical breakdown of the polymer. The original report, a flimsy edifice built on assumptions, now looked ready to crumble. I requested a meeting with the lead detective on the initial case. He was a man with a reputation for closing cases quickly, efficiently. Kaplan, the detective began, not looking up from a document he was initialing. I appreciate your thoroughness, but this case is closed. Thorne's family has accepted the findings. We've moved on. I laid out my photographs, the detailed report. Detective, the initial assessment missed critical details. It's a polymer used in bespoke server components. It suggests the destruction of specific high-value tech, not just paper documents. And it was found in proximity to where Thorne's final movements were recorded. The detective finally looked up, his eyes weary, but also holding a glint of irritation. Look, Kaplan, I understand you like to dig, but sometimes a suicide is just a suicide. Thorne was under immense pressure. The financial reports, the market fluctuations, it all pointed to a man at the end of his rope. This green smudge, it's circumstantial at best, could be anything. A cleaner's glove, a pen, 100 other things. The chemical analysis is precise, I countered, my voice steady despite the rising frustration. It's not just anything. He leaned back, a sigh escaping him. And what are you suggesting? Come on, Kaplan. We have a family grieving, a public ready to move on. Reopening this would be a political nightmare. And frankly, your evidence, while academically interesting, doesn't overturn a comprehensive investigation and a clear-cut medical examiner's report. He was dismissing me. Not just my findings, but my entire premise. The system, it seemed, was more interested in maintaining the status quo than uncovering a difficult truth. The resistance didn't stop there. A formal letter arrived the next morning, signed by a consortium of legal representatives for the Thorne estate. It was polite, yet firm, expressing their deep concern over my continued unsolicited investigation into a matter already comprehensively resolved. It warned against baseless speculation that could cause further distress to the grieving family and damage the legacy of the deceased. The message was clear. Back off. The next step was to revisit the assistant, the nervous young woman who had discovered Thorne. I remembered her trembling hands, her wide, frightened eyes. He had been cooperative, if hesitant, during the initial interviews. I found her in a small, sterile waiting area outside a corporate meeting room, her face pale, her posture stiff. I just have a few more questions about the day you found him. I began gently, sitting opposite her. She flinched, her gaze darting to the closed door behind her. I've already told the detective everything. My memory it's not clear anymore. It was a traumatic event. Her voice was barely a whisper, devoid of the earlier, almost frantic honesty. Did anyone contact you after the initial investigation? I pressed, leaning forward slightly. Anyone from the family? Or their legal team? Her eyes, now devoid of their previous fear, were flat, almost lifeless. I've been advised not to discuss the matter further. It's all in the official report. She rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the tiled floor. I have to go. My legal counsel has made it clear I'm not to speak about this again. She walked away, a ghost of her former self, leaving me in the quiet, sterile corridor. The shift was stark. Someone had gotten to her, and the message was unambiguous. The walls were closing in, not from the killer, but from the very system designed to uncover the truth. My green smear, my meticulous analysis, meant nothing against the weight of power and the desire for convenient narratives. But it only solidified my resolve. I wouldn't let this go. Thorne deserved more. The sterile corridor, moments after the colleague's retreat, still hummed with a quiet tension, a silent reverberation of her fear. Her words, or rather her lack of them, had confirmed my suspicions. The system wasn't just resistant to the truth, it was actively suppressing it. But retreat wasn't an option. I returned to the secure examination room, the heavy steel door thudding shut behind me, sealing me in with the cold light of the overhead fluorescents and the silent witnesses of the deceased tech mogul's demise. I pulled the initial crime scene photos onto the large screen, zooming in on the periphery, the areas the first investigators might have dismissed as irrelevant. My eyes scanned the floorboards around the alleged suicide point, the baseboards, the undersides of furniture. The green smear, a faint residue I'd initially dismissed as environmental, now demanded my full attention. It wasn't paint, nor was it a common household chemical. I used a microspectrometer, gently sampling the almost invisible flecks. The results, displayed on the adjacent monitor, showed a complex organic compound, a polymer unlike anything I'd encountered in routine environmental contamination. It contained trace elements of a rare earth metal, and its molecular structure hinted at a highly specialized sealant or adhesive. My fingers, guided by years of practice, moved with a surgical precision. My gaze locked onto a section of the wall near the window, just above where the victim's hand had supposedly slipped. There, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a faint impression. It wasn't a fingerprint. It was too broad, too diffuse, yet it possessed a distinct, almost woven pattern. I requested the high-resolution scans of that wall section, applying various light filters and contrast enhancements. Hours blurred into a singular, focused effort. Finally, a unique pattern emerged from the digital noise. A finely textured, almost cellular impression. It was intricate, repetitive, and unlike any fabric weave I knew. It wasn't from clothing. It wasn't from a glove made of standard leather or latex. This was something else entirely. The pattern, when magnified thousands of times, revealed microscopic hexagonal facets, interconnected by minute filaments. It looked like a specialized grip, perhaps from a tool, but too large, too uniform. Then it clicked. This wasn't a tool. This was a surface, a contact point. The pattern suggested a material designed for maximum friction, for a secure hold on a slick surface, yet also lightweight and non-abrasive. It reminded me of specialized equipment used in highly controlled environments, or perhaps by individuals requiring precise, unyielding grip without leaving easily identifiable marks. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The complex polymer, the rare earth metal, the unique hexagonal imprint. This wasn't a random occurrence. This was the signature of a professional. Someone who used specific high-tech gear. Someone who knew how to operate without leaving conventional traces. The initial investigators, looking for fingerprints or obvious tool marks, would have missed this entirely. The specialized suspect profile began to form in my mind. Not a common criminal. Not a spur-of-the-moment attacker. This pointed to someone with training, discipline, and access to highly specialized equipment. Covert operations, high-stakes security, perhaps even intelligence work. The kind of individual who moved through the shadows of power, leaving barely a whisper behind. The very echelons of power the premise had hinted at. The system wasn't just covering up a murder, it was protecting one of its own. This wasn't just a staged suicide. It was a meticulously orchestrated execution, carried out by someone operating on a different plane of sophistication. And they had made one, tiny, almost invisible mistake. My next step was clear. This kind of specialized material, this unique polymer, wouldn't be found just anywhere. It spoke of bespoke solutions, perhaps even proprietary technology. I started cross-referencing the chemical signature and the structural pattern against databases of specialized materials, patents, and even obscure military and industrial applications. The search led me down a rabbit hole of shell corporations and offshore registrations, a labyrinth designed to obscure ownership and operations. One name, repeatedly linked to the manufacturing and distribution of advanced composite materials, kept surfacing. A legal entity, ostensibly a consultancy firm, with a primary address listed in a low-rise, featureless building several thousand miles away. The stakes had just been raised. I knew I couldn't just walk into a place like that and expect answers. I needed a pretext, a reason to be there, or at least a reason to observe. The determination I felt was a hard, sharp edge, honed by the colleagues' fear and the sheer audacity of the cover-up. I was no longer just a pathologist. I was an intruder into a world of hidden influence. I made a few discreet calls, pulling on old favors, activating a network of contacts I rarely used. My destination was set. A few days later, I found myself standing across the street from the address, a glass-fronted building that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The air was thick with the scent of salt and exhaust. Inside, I knew, were the mechanisms of secrecy. I could almost feel the hum of the shredders, the clink of tumblers in those locked safes, protecting truths I was now determined to unearth. The building itself was a fortress of paper and digital concealment, a physical manifestation of the system I was fighting. I watched the entrance, a knot tightening in my stomach. My meticulous work, the re-examination of the tech mogul's supposed suicide, had struck a nerve. A deep, festering wound in the carefully constructed narrative. I stood there, the weight of her unspoken warning settling heavy on my shoulders. It wasn't just about finding a killer anymore. It was about navigating a labyrinth of deliberate obfuscation. The official channels were clearly compromised. Every avenue I'd tried to pursue through standard procedures had met with an unseen barrier, a polite but firm redirection. It meant I had to step outside. My mind replayed the fragments of information I'd gathered, the whispers of an intricate financial web surrounding the tech mogul's empire, rumors of shell corporations and offshore dealings. It was a long shot, a desperate reach, but the colleagues' terrified silence had pushed me past the point of caution. The journey was a blur of calculated risks. The air inside was cool, recycled, carrying the faint scent of polished stone and something metallic like toner. The receptionist, a young woman with eyes that seemed to track my every move, directed me to a waiting area, but my true target lay beyond. I slipped away during a manufactured distraction, a dropped briefcase, a conveniently spilled coffee. The corridors were a maze of frosted glass and muted lighting, designed to disorient, to funnel visitors. I found the office I was looking for, its nameplate a simple, elegant script. The door was locked, as expected, but the latch was old, a simple mechanism yielding to a carefully applied pressure tool from my small, discreet kit. Inside, the office was stark, functional. Desks were clear, computers logged off. My gaze immediately went to the back wall, where a row of industrial-grade shred bins stood, their gaping mouths ready to devour secrets. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. I started with the shred bins, not to retrieve anything, but to observe. The contents were a confetti of paper, but one bin, larger than the others, contained a recent, almost pristine shred of a specific high-gloss financial document. It was a statement, or a report header, the typeface distinct, too familiar from the tech mogul's publicly available corporate filings. This wasn't incidental. Someone had been thorough, but not perfect. Then, the safes. They were a challenge, too robust for my small kit, but I wasn't looking for what was inside them, not directly. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale paper. It was a backup, a relic. I connected it to my portable forensic acquisition device, a compact unit I always carried. The data transfer was slow, agonizingly so, each byte feeling like a lifetime. As the files began to populate, a pattern emerged. Alongside these, I found internal memos discussing the optimal conditions for various experimental phases, including specific atmospheric pressures and temperature ranges, and even the precise chemical composition of certain inert gases used in the prototyping process. My breath hitched. But these schematics, these optimal conditions for the prototype, they pointed to something else entirely. The subtle discrepancies I'd found in the initial forensic analysis, the minute details overlooked, the precise angle of impact, the peculiar bruising pattern, the almost imperceptible chemical residue on the skin. They weren't just anomalies. They were engineered. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The killer wasn't just a brute or even a clever opportunist. They possessed a profound, almost surgical understanding of forensic science, a knowledge of how to manipulate a scene, how to introduce subtle physiological changes that would mimic natural causes or common accidents. The pulmonary edema, the bruising, the chemical residue. They were all part of a meticulously crafted illusion, replicating the effects of a specific controlled environment, one that mimicked the conditions of the tech mogul's own prototype. This wasn't just about corporate espionage. This was about a killer who could weaponize science, who could use the victim's own work against him, creating a death so perfectly disguised it would fool all but the most obsessive eye. Someone with scientific expertise, access to advanced technology, and a motive deep enough to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. My initial assumption of a simple cover-up now felt naive. This was a calculated dismantling, a precise elimination, executed by a mind that understood the very intricacies I dedicated my life to uncovering. The system wasn't just resistant to the truth, it was being played by a master manipulator. And I, Seth Kaplan, had just stepped onto their chessboard. The quiet tension that had clung to the sterile corridor after the colleague's retreat remained, a palpable echo of her unspoken warning. Her hurried exit, the flicker of genuine fear in her eyes, had solidified my suspicions. The system wasn't merely resistant to the truth. It was actively engaged in its suppression. The game, I realized, had just changed. I returned to my forensic examination space, the fluorescent lights humming with an unnerving consistency. The air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken presence. I moved with a heightened awareness, my senses sharpened by the recent encounter. Nothing immediately jumped out, but my gaze swept across my workbench, the neatly organized trays of instruments, the meticulously labeled evidence containers. My eyes narrowed. I always wiped the floor before leaving for the night. The microfiber cloth I used for cleaning lenses, usually folded squarely and placed under the dissecting microscope, lay crumpled slightly, its edges uneven. A trivial detail, perhaps, but I was a creature of habit, and that cloth was never left in disarray. My fingers brushed the surface of the microscope. The fine dust that always settled, no matter how often I cleaned, was disturbed in one small area, a faint smudge marring the pristine chrome. Someone had been here. Someone had touched my equipment. A cold certainty settled in my gut, sharper than any scalpel. This wasn't just a random intrusion. This was a message. They knew I was digging. They knew I was close. I moved slowly, deliberately, my eyes scanning every surface, every shadow. Under the edge of a heavy steel cabinet, tucked almost out of sight, a tiny red pinprick of light pulsed rhythmically. A miniature camera, no bigger than my thumbnail, its lens pointed directly at my primary workstation. They weren't just watching my work, they were watching me. The air grew thick, suffocating. Working alone was no longer an option, not if I wanted to stay ahead or even just stay safe. I needed an ally, someone whose moral compass pointed true north, even if their initial inclination was skepticism. There was only one person who fit that description, the detective who had originally caught the tech mogul's case before it was hastily closed. He had a reputation for being thorough, if a little cynical. I found him in his precinct office, buried under a stack of case files, his tie loosened, a half-empty mug of lukewarm coffee steaming beside him. He looked up, his eyes, tired but sharp, assessing me. "Kaplan?" he grunted, a question in his tone. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Last I checked, the Mogul's case was a done deal." "It's not," I stated, my voice low and steady, conveying the urgency I felt. "And I have reason to believe the done deal is being actively protected." He leaned back, his chair groaning under his weight. Protected? By whom, and from what? His skepticism was a thick wall, but I could sense the underlying curiosity, the flicker of the ethical investigator. I laid out my findings, starting with the subtle discrepancies in the initial autopsy, the impossible trajectory of the fall, the staged scene. Then I moved to the more recent developments. My colleague was warned off. Today, my examination space was accessed. Nothing was taken, but things were subtly disturbed. And I found this. I pulled out a small, shielded container, revealing the tiny camera. They're watching me. They know I'm onto something. The detective picked up the miniature device, turning it over in his calloused fingers. His brow furrowed. A little sophisticated for your average street-level cover-up. He placed it back down, his gaze meeting mine, a new seriousness replacing the initial weariness. "So, you're saying someone went to a lot of trouble to make a murder look like a suicide. Now they're watching you because you're unraveling it." "Precisely," I confirmed. "And the scope of the cover-up, the resources involved, it suggests something far beyond a simple criminal act. This points to power, influence, and a deep desire to bury the truth." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. I remember a detail from the initial incident report, something that always felt out of place. A financial transaction, a substantial sum, routed through a specific legal entity in the days leading up to the Mogul's death. It was flagged as unusual, but then dismissed as a routine corporate maneuver. The detective stiffened, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. That detail, I remember it. It was a dead end for me. I tried to push for access, but it was like hitting a brick wall. Superior officers citing international legal complexities shut me down. His voice was tight, a hint of old frustration resurfacing. They said it was irrelevant to a suicide investigation. "But it's not irrelevant to a staged murder, is it?" I pressed, seeing the pieces click into place for him. That office, designed for opacity, for the discreet management of sensitive affairs, could be the nerve center of this operation. The place where the strings are pulled, the evidence shredded, the secrets locked away. He leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, the cynicism in his eyes replaced by a simmering resolve. "You think the money was part of the payoff? That all costs money." The wall of skepticism was crumbling. "If what you're saying is true, Kaplan, this is bigger than anything I've ever touched, and a lot more dangerous." "It is," I agreed, my voice unwavering. "But the truth is still there, waiting to be uncovered." He took a deep, deliberate breath, his gaze hardening. "All right, tell me everything, from the very beginning." It wasn't an easy alliance, born out of shared suspicion and a mutual commitment to justice, but it was an alliance nonetheless. The game had not just changed, it had escalated. And now I wasn't playing alone. "All right, tell me everything." And now I was ready to play. My coffee, long since cold, sat untouched. For the past 3 hours, we'd been piecing together the ghost of an organization, a shadow network that had insulated the late Mogul. The official narrative, the one everyone accepted, painted him as a recluse, a visionary unburdened by mundane concerns. The truth, as it always did, proved far more intricate. "The official security reports for the Mogul's estate," the detective began, tapping a finger on a diagram. "They're pristine, too pristine. Every sensor logged, every camera feed accounted for. A ghost key. It explained the lack of forced entry, the seamless breach. And who would have access to a protocol like that? I asked, my voice low. The detective pushed a grainy photograph across the table. It showed a man in his late 40s, sharp-eyed, with an unsettlingly calm demeanor. This is our guy. A corporate security specialist goes by the name of Elias Thorne. Brilliant, obsessive, former special operations, then transitioned into private sector protection. He designed the Mogul's entire security infrastructure, including the Ghost Key system. This wasn't just a killer. This was an architect of deception, a meticulous engineer of misdirection. His profile fits, I conceded. The precision in the staging, the way every detail was designed to point to suicide, it requires an intimate knowledge of the scene and forensic procedure. He wasn't just covering his tracks, he was laying down a false trail. The detective nodded. Exactly. My informant says Thorne was quietly removed from his position a few weeks before the Mogul's death. Officially, restructuring. Unofficially, he was digging into some financial irregularities, asking too many questions about offshore accounts linked to the Mogul's inner circle. He was a threat, but too valuable, too dangerous to simply disappear, in a way that wouldn't draw attention. So he was framed for something. He was about to expose something. They decided to eliminate the Mogul and frame him for it. I considered the timeline. Or he decided to eliminate the Mogul for what he knew, then disappear, knowing his removal from security would make him the prime suspect. Either way, the detective said, he's vanished. Cleanly. No digital footprint, no paper trail. Except for one thing. He slid a small, almost imperceptible piece of fabric across the table. This was found snagged on a loose floorboard in Thorne's last known office, deep within the corporate headquarters. It's a synthetic fiber, unique. My informant says Thorne was particular about his gear. Wore custom-made tactical gloves, lined with this exact material. It's not standard issue. And it has trace epidermal cells on it. Not Thorne's. My breath caught. The killers? Possibly. But we need more. Something definitive that ties him to our scene, and not just to Thorne's office. Something irrefutable. We spent another hour tracing Thorne's movements, his known associates, and his hidden connections. The detective's network, it turned out, was as intricate as the web Thorne had spun. We found a lead, a shell corporation, seemingly dormant, but with a recent unexplained data transfer. And maybe, just maybe, something he took from the crime scene, something that implicates him directly. Accessing the office wasn't a matter of simply walking in. The detective pulled strings, leveraged favors, and, I suspected, bent a few rules. We arrived under the guise of an emergency compliance audit. A thin veil of legitimacy that bought us a precious hour. The building was a sleek, sterile monolith of glass and steel, an architectural statement of impenetrable secrecy. The air was dry, smelling faintly of ozone and old paper. We moved with purpose, the detective keeping a lookout while I focused on the minutia. I ignored the stacks of folders, the gleaming computers, the intimidating rows of locked safes. I was looking for the anomalous, the out of place. The shred bins, massive industrial units, stood like hungry beasts in a back room. Their contents were already reduced to confetti. I ran my gloved hand over the edge of one, feeling the faint vibration of its recent use. Nothing. Then, tucked away in a corner, behind a forgotten potted plant near a rarely used filing cabinet, I saw it. A sliver of iridescent material, barely visible against the polished concrete floor. It was caught on a tiny, almost microscopic burr in the concrete, a defect in the otherwise flawless surface. I knelt, my breath held, and carefully extracted it with tweezers. It was a fragment, no larger than a grain of rice, of the same unique synthetic fiber the detective had shown me earlier. I brought it closer, pulling a small magnifying glass from my kit. And a unique DNA marker. I looked up at the detective, a grim satisfaction settling over me. This is from the killer. And it's the exact same fiber from Thorne's gloves. The detective's face, usually impassive, showed a flicker of triumph. Then we have him, the brilliant corporate security specialist, Elias Thorne. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, a microscopic thread connecting an absent killer to a meticulously staged crime. The air, cool and filtered, carried a faint scent of old paper and expensive cleaning products. My spine felt rigid, a blend of apprehension and fierce determination. This was it, the culmination of weeks spent chasing shadows and deciphering the silent language of the deceased. The room, a large conference space, was stark. A heavy, dark wood table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. At the far end, facing the expansive cityscape, sat the executive, the tech mogul's former business partner. His posture was unnervingly calm, a practiced mask I recognized from countless investigations. Beside him, his legal counsel, a sharp-featured woman in a pristine suit, kept her gaze fixed on me. Across from them, the detective, his expression a carefully neutral facade, nodded slightly as I took my seat. I laid my evidence brief on the table, a thin folder containing everything. No theatrics, just facts. My gaze swept over the executive, then settled on the detective. "Thank you for arranging this, detective," I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremor in my hands. "My findings are complete." The executive shifted, a barely perceptible movement. "Pathologist Kaplan," he said, his voice smooth. "We've been over this. The initial report was clear, a tragic suicide." "It looked clear," I corrected, my eyes locking with his. That was the intent. My re-examination revealed a meticulously constructed illusion. I opened my folder, pulling out enlarged photographs. The initial findings focused on the trauma consistent with a fall from a significant height. What they overlooked were the subtle discrepancies. I pushed the first image across the table. A close-up of the victim's hand. No defensive wounds. No struggle. But more importantly, the specific fracture patterns weren't entirely consistent with an unassisted impact from that particular trajectory. There was a slight deviation, a rotational aspect that suggested a body already inert, already positioned. I paused, letting the words hang in the tense air. And then there's this. I presented another image. It was a microscopic view, almost abstract in its detail, of a single gleaming filament. This is a synthetic fiber, less than a micron in diameter, invisible to the naked eye. It was found embedded deep within the victim's epidermal layer, near the base of the neck. It's not a common household fiber. It's a specialized high-tensile polymer, used in a very specific type of industrial insulation. His legal counsel leaned forward, a low murmur passing between them. "If this fiber," I continued, my voice gaining momentum, "was transferred from the killer to the victim during the act of incapacitation. The tech mogul wasn't conscious when he fell. He was rendered unresponsive first, likely through a fast-acting sedative, then transported and dropped from the ledge. The subsequent impact was designed to obscure the true cause of death and the method of disposal." I picked up another photograph, showing a faint, almost imperceptible bruising pattern on the victim's inner arm. This wasn't caused by the fall. This is consistent with a pressure point hold applied to subdue. And the sedative? A minute trace, metabolized almost completely, but enough for my lab to identify its unique signature. A custom synthesized variant, often developed for discrete, high-stakes applications. The kind that might be acquired through illicit channels by someone with significant resources and a need for absolute discretion. The executive pushed his chair back, a scrape against the polished floor. "This is preposterous. Circumstantial nonsense. You're fabricating a fantasy to justify your own ego." "Am I?" I met his furious gaze, unblinking. The motive became clear once I understood the method. The tech mogul was on the verge of exposing a massive financial fraud, a shell corporation scheme designed to siphon billions from his own company. The evidence for this, I believe, was meticulously stored, perhaps even within one of these very locked safes in this office. Perhaps was among the documents shredded in those shred bins you requested access to just last week, sir. My gesture encompassed the room, the silent shredders standing like sentinels of forgotten truths. He was going to blow the whistle. Your entire empire, built on deceit, was about to collapse. The executive's face, previously a mask of cool indifference, contorted. His eyes darted toward his legal counsel, then back to me, a predator caught in a snare. You have no proof of any fraud. This is slander. The proof, I stated, is the motive. It explains why the tech mogul, a man known for his meticulous planning and careful risk assessment, would suddenly commit suicide right before a crucial board meeting where he was scheduled to present sensitive financial disclosures. It explains why the scene was so carefully manipulated, why the incapacitating agent was so rare, and why you, sir, were the last person to see him alive in his penthouse. The detective rose slowly from his seat. His hand moved subtly toward his belt. Sir, he addressed the executive, his voice low but firm. Dr. Kaplan has presented compelling forensic evidence. I believe we need to discuss this further down at the precinct. The executive's legal counsel started to object, but her client cut her off with a sharp, dismissive wave. A primal rage flickered in his eyes. He slammed his fist on the table, making the brief jump. This is a witch hunt. You'll regret this, Kaplan. The detective was faster, tackling him before he could grasp whatever desperate measure he intended. The struggle was brief, brutal. The executive, thrashing and cursing, was quickly subdued. The metallic glint of handcuffs was the only sound in the silent, expensive office. My breath, which I hadn't realized I was holding, finally escaped in a long, slow exhale. The game was indeed over. The struggle was brief, brutal, and utterly devoid of dignity. My gaze, however, was fixed on the heavy credenza. What had he been reaching for? Once the executive was cuffed and secured by the attending officers, the detective, his breathing heavy but controlled, nodded towards the furniture. Check it, Seth. I moved cautiously, my senses on high alert. The credenza was a solid block of dark wood, ornate carvings concealing its true nature. My fingers traced the cold brass handles of the drawers, then ran along the top, searching for a seam, a hidden catch. A pressure point, perhaps? I pressed, and with a soft click, a narrow compartment sprang open. Inside, nestled on a velvet lining, was not a weapon, but a single antiquated brass key, heavy and intricately cut. Beside it lay a small, encrypted data chip, no bigger than my thumbnail. He knew what I had found. This, I murmured, holding up the key and the chip, was his last resort. The detective took the items from my hand, his brow furrowed in thought. A key and a chip. Not exactly a smoking gun. A lead. A lead to what exactly? I asked, my mind already racing through possibilities. He manages the legal affairs for several offshore entities, including Thorne's company, the detective explained, pocketing the items. If there's a place he'd hide something truly damning, it would be in one of those. The building itself was a monument to discretion, its facade nondescript, its interior hushed and sterile. The air hummed with the silent tension of secrets being kept, and perhaps destroyed. The legal team, initially resistant, became considerably more cooperative when presented with the warrant and the sight of uniformed officers. Shred bins in the corner overflowed with paper confetti, a testament to recent frantic activity. A formidable wall of locked safes dominated one side of the room. Which one? I asked, looking at the array of steel doors. The detective held up the brass key. This isn't for a standard safe deposit box. It's too specific, too old-fashioned. He examined the key, then the safes, his gaze finally settling on a small, recessed panel near the floor, almost hidden behind a faux baseboard. He knelt, ran his fingers along the seam, and with a grunt, pulled it open. Behind it, A single heavy steel box, unlike the others. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. As the detective turned it, the mechanism groaned and the heavy door swung inward. Inside, there was no treasure, no stacks of cash. Instead, a meticulously organized collection of documents and a secure, portable hard drive. My breath hitched. This was it. We worked methodically. The documents were a damning chronicle. Coded financial ledgers detailing illicit transfers, shell corporations, and a massive, decades-long data harvesting operation that exploited user privacy on a global scale. His suicide was a meticulously planned silencing. The hard drive, once decrypted with the help of a technical specialist brought in by the detective, held the final, undeniable proof. It contained encrypted communication logs between the executive and several other high-ranking officials, detailing the planning of Thorne's murder, the staging of the scene, and the initial cover-up. My initial forensic observations, the subtle discrepancies I'd fought so hard to highlight, were all confirmed, every single one. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just a murder. It was an assassination designed to protect a financial empire built on deceit and exploitation. News of the arrests, fueled by the evidence unearthed in that sterile offshore law office with shred bins and locked safes, exploded across every major network within hours. The corporate world reeled. High-profile executives, politicians, and even a few seemingly untouchable figures were implicated. The dominoes fell quickly, their crashes echoing through the halls of power. For me, the fallout was immediate and overwhelming. My name, once confined to academic journals and forensic reports, was plastered across headlines. Forensic pathologist uncovers global conspiracy. Seth Kaplan, the man who cracked the Thorne case. The vindication was immense, a quiet triumph against a system that had tried to bury the truth. But it came with a heavy cost. My phone became a constant source of buzzing demands. Interviews, statements, expert opinions. Colleagues, some of whom had initially dismissed my theories, now offered congratulations, tinged with a palpable sense of awe and perhaps a little envy. There was also the less pleasant attention. Veiled threats from anonymous sources, scrutiny from those still connected to the fallen empire, and the crushing weight of public expectation. Every word I uttered was now dissected, every past case re-examined. I found myself retreating, seeking solace in the quiet solitude of my apartment, the only place where the clamor of the outside world felt distant. The work was done, the truth exposed. The tension hadn't vanished. It had merely shifted from the hunt for truth to the fight for its enduring legacy. I moved with a practiced calm, my gaze sweeping over the meticulously polished mahogany and the framed, innocuous prints that lined the walls. Each shred bin, each locked safe, represented a potential vault for the truth, and the air hummed with the barely contained fury of the executive we'd brought in. He stood rigid, flanked by his own legal counsel, his face a mask of indignation that barely concealed a tremor of panic. "You have no right," the executive hissed, his voice tight with suppressed rage, as a uniformed officer began prying open a particularly stubborn filing cabinet. "This is a gross overreach. The warrant says otherwise." The lead detective countered, his tone flat, unwavering. He nodded towards me, a silent acknowledgement of the meticulous work that had led us here. My eyes, however, were fixed on a small, unassuming server rack tucked away in a rarely used utility closet, disguised as part of the building's climate control system. It was an elegant deception, precisely the kind of detail I'd come to expect from this elaborate charade. "That's not on the warrant." The executive's counsel interjected, stepping forward. "Anything connected to the network, anything containing records relevant to the tech mogul's finances or communications, is fair game," I stated, my voice cutting through the escalating tension. I pointed to the rack. "That unit isn't just for HVAC. It's running a separate power supply and network connection." A colleague, an expert in digital forensics, was already moving towards it, his fingers flying across a portable diagnostic tool. The executive's eyes widened fractionally, a telltale sign that we were on the right track. The hidden server, a ghost in the machine, was the linchpin. Within minutes, the colleague had bypassed the initial security, a cascade of green text scrolling across his screen. "Bingo," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the low hum of the server. "Encrypted drives, deeply nested." My pulse quickened, a controlled surge of adrenaline. This wasn't merely about finding evidence. It was about dismantling a carefully constructed illusion. The colleague began the arduous process of data extraction, the room falling into a tense silence broken only by the whirring of the server and the occasional click of a keyboard. Hours bled into one another. The executive and his counsel remained, their defiance slowly eroding into a palpable despair as the digital footprint of their machinations became undeniable. Finally, a triumphant exhale from the colleague. "Got it. Detailed transaction logs, encrypted communications, and a set of schematics. Looks like a custom-built drone designed for precision delivery, and a series of instructions, signed and dated, outlining the precise staging of the tech mogul's suicide." The air left the executive's lungs in a ragged gasp. The truth, meticulously uncovered, lay bare. A sophisticated hit, disguised as despair, orchestrated by those who stood to gain most from the tech mogul's silence. It was all there. The financial transfers, the coded messages, the blueprint of the very tool used to stage the fall. My mind replayed the initial autopsy, the subtle fractures, the unusual trajectory. Every discrepancy, every nagging doubt, now had its irrefutable explanation. The system, so resistant to the truth, was now confronted with an avalanche of undeniable facts. The journey back to my own department, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked window of the patrol car, felt like a descent from a high peak. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak, but underneath, a profound sense of vindication simmered. The fight wasn't over. Bringing those in the highest echelons of power to justice would be another battle entirely, one fraught with political maneuvering and endless appeals. But the central mystery, the truth of the tech mogul's demise, was no longer a question mark. It was an exclamation point. Days later, the department's main conference room, usually a scene of mundane bureaucratic updates, was hushed. The chief administrator, a man whose measured words usually carried the weight of a decree, stood before the assembled forensic specialists. His gaze swept across the room, finally resting on me. "Dr. Kaplan," he began, his voice devoid of its usual formality. "Your work on the tech mogul case. It's a testament to the unwavering pursuit of truth. Against significant pressure, against a narrative that was, for all intents and purposes, accepted, you followed the evidence. You saw what others missed." A quiet ripple of acknowledgement went through my colleagues. It wasn't effusive praise, but it was respect, earned through the grinding hours and the refusal to compromise. I simply nodded, a tight knot in my chest loosening. It wasn't about accolades. It was about the integrity of the process, the silent promise I'd made to the deceased. Later, alone in my office, the muted hum of the ventilation system a familiar comfort. I stared at the blank surface of my desk. The tech mogul's case file, now meticulously organized and awaiting transfer to the prosecution, sat in a sealed box by the door. This case had been more than just a puzzle. It had been a crucible, testing not just my skills, but my resolve. A new folder lay innocuously on the corner of my desk, thin and unassuming. My fingers brushed the cover, a familiar stirring of curiosity, a renewed purpose. And I, Seth Kaplan, was ready to listen.